The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, is one of the most famous and decisive battles in European history. It marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius who had dominated Europe for over a decade. The battle took place near the village of Waterloo, in present-day Belgium, and pitted Napoleon's French army against the coalition forces led by the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Gebhard Lieberecht von Blücher. Waterloo is often remembered as a turning point in European history, one that ushered in a new era of political balance in the continent and set the stage for the long period of peace that followed. Context and prelude to the battle. The Battle of Waterloo did not arise in isolation but was the culmination of years of political instability and warfare in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804, had spent much of the early 19th century expanding French territories and establishing a dominant influence across Europe. By 1812, however, the tides began to turn against him, most notably with the disastrous Russian campaign that severely weakened his army. In 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The Bourbon monarchy, led by King Louis XVIII, was restored in France. However, in March 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France, rallying troops and supporters as he marched towards Paris. His return, known as the 100 Days, alarmed the European powers who had defeated him. They quickly formed the Seventh Coalition, consisting of the United Kingdom, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and other allied nations, with the intention of removing Napoleon from power once and for all. Napoleon's strategy and coalition forces. Napoleon knew that his chances of long-term success were slim. He faced a powerful coalition of European nations that were determined to restore the pre-Napoleonic order. To survive, Napoleon needed to act quickly and decisively. His strategy was to strike first and defeat the coalition armies piecemeal before they could combine their forces. His immediate focus was on the Anglo-Dutch army commanded by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army led by Marshal Blücher. Both armies were stationed in present-day Belgium, and Napoleon planned to destroy them before the larger coalition forces could fully mobilize. On June 16, 1815, Napoleon's army engaged the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny, defeating them but failing to deliver a crushing blow. On the same day, his subordinate, Marshal Michel Ney, engaged Wellington's forces at the Battle of Quatre Bras. Although the French made some initial gains, Ney was unable to prevent Wellington from withdrawing his army in good order towards the village of Waterloo. Wellington chose this location because it provided favorable defensive terrain, a ridge that offered protection and a good field of fire for his troops. The battlefield. The battlefield at Waterloo stretched across a relatively small area, about 4 kilometers long. Wellington's army took up a defensive position on a ridge near the village of Mont Saint-Jean, while Napoleon's forces deployed to the south, near the village of La Belle Alliance. Wellington's forces, composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, numbered around 68,000 men and 150 cannons. Blücher's Prussian army, which had been regrouping after its defeat at Ligny, was expected to arrive with around 50,000 troops to reinforce Wellington. Napoleon's army, composed of veteran French troops, was about 73,000 strong, with 250 cannons. Despite being slightly outnumbered, Napoleon believed his highly experienced soldiers, especially the Imperial Guard, would give him the advantage in battle. He was also counting on the delayed arrival of the Prussian army, hoping to defeat Wellington before Blücher could reinforce him. The morning of June 18. On the morning of June 18, 1815, the battle began under overcast skies and with heavy rain from the previous night having made the ground muddy. This delayed the start of the battle until around 11:30 a.m., as Napoleon wanted to allow the ground to dry somewhat, especially to ensure that his artillery could be more effective. The first major action of the day occurred when Napoleon ordered an assault on Hougoumont, a fortified farm on Wellington's right flank. This attack was intended to draw Wellington's reserves away from the center of his line. The French assault on Hougoumont began with a bombardment followed by infantry attacks, but the farm was fiercely defended by British and German troops. The fighting at Hougoumont would continue throughout the day, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Despite the heavy French pressure, the defenders managed to hold their position, preventing Napoleon from achieving his objective. The French attacks and Wellington's defense. While the fight for Hougoumont raged on, Napoleon launched a major assault in the center of the battlefield. He ordered Marshal Ney to lead a large-scale infantry attack against Wellington's position. The French infantry advanced in large columns, with artillery support, toward the ridge held by the Anglo-Dutch forces. Wellington had deployed his troops behind the ridge to minimize casualties from the French artillery. As the French columns advanced, they were met with disciplined volleys of musket fire and cannon shot from Wellington's forces. At the same time, the French launched another attack on La Haye-Sainte, a farm located near the center of Wellington's line. La Haye-Sainte was fiercely defended by German troops in British service, who held out for several hours. Eventually, however, the French managed to capture the farm, creating a gap in Wellington's center. Despite this, Wellington's line did not break, and his troops continued to hold the ridge. Around mid-afternoon, Napoleon received reports that the Prussians, under Blücher, were approaching from the east. This was a critical development, as it meant that Napoleon now faced the prospect of fighting a two-front battle. In response, Napoleon dispatched part of his forces, under General Lübau, to delay the Prussian advance while he continued to focus on defeating Ney's cavalry charges. As the battle progressed, Ney, believing that Wellington's forces were wavering, ordered a series of massive cavalry charges against the center of the Anglo-Dutch line. Ney was under the mistaken impression that Wellington's troops were retreating, but in reality, they were simply repositioning to strengthen their defense. Ney's cavalry, numbering thousands of horsemen, charged repeatedly up the ridge towards the Anglo-Dutch infantry squares. The British and Allied infantry formed into defensive squares, a tactic designed to protect against cavalry attacks. The cavalry charges were spectacular but ultimately ineffective. The squares held firm, and the French cavalry was unable to break through. Ney's repeated assaults were costly, as they left the French cavalry exhausted and vulnerable to counterattacks. Moreover, Ney had committed a significant portion of the French reserves in these futile charges, weakening Napoleon's overall position. The arrival of the Prussians. By late afternoon, the situation for Napoleon was becoming increasingly dire. The Prussians, under Blücher, had arrived on the battlefield and began to attack the French right flank. Napoleon had anticipated this possibility and had deployed General Lübau's corps to hold off the Prussian advance. However, the Prussian pressure continued to grow, and Lübau's forces were eventually overwhelmed. As the Prussians pushed forward, they began to threaten Napoleon's rear, creating a precarious situation for the French. Despite this, Napoleon still believed he could achieve victory by breaking Wellington's line before the Prussians fully joined the battle, the Imperial Guard and the final French assault. In a last-ditch effort to win the battle, Napoleon ordered his elite Imperial Guard, the most feared and experienced troops in the French army, to attack the center of Wellington's line. The Imperial Guard had a reputation for being nearly invincible, having never been defeated in battle. Their advance was intended to deliver the decisive blow that would break the Anglo-Dutch army and secure victory for Napoleon. The Imperial Guard advanced up the ridge in tight formation, but they were met with heavy fire from British, Dutch, and Belgian troops. As they crested the ridge, they were caught in a devastating crossfire of musketry and artillery. Despite their reputation for invincibility, the Imperial Guard faltered under the intense fire, and their advance stalled. Wellington, seeing the opportunity, ordered a counterattack. The British and Allied troops charged forward, breaking the Imperial Guard and forcing them to retreat. The retreat of the Imperial Guard signaled the collapse of the French army. Napoleon's forces, exhausted and demoralized, began to retreat in disarray. The arrival of additional Prussian troops only accelerated the French collapse. By evening, the battle was over, and Napoleon's army had been decisively defeated. Aftermath and significance. The Battle of Waterloo was a decisive and catastrophic defeat for Napoleon. He fled the battlefield and returned to Paris, where he abdicated the throne for the second time on June 22, 1815. He was eventually captured by British forces and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the rest of his life. He died there in 1821. For Europe, the victory at Waterloo marked the end of more than 2 decades of warfare that had begun with the French Revolution in 1789. The defeat of Napoleon allowed the victorious powers, including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, to restore a balance of power in Europe. The Congress of Vienna, which had already begun before Napoleon's return, was able to proceed with its plans to redraw the map of Europe and restore stability to the continent. The peace that followed the Battle of Waterloo lasted for nearly 4 decades, with no major wars between the great powers until the Crimean War in 1853. This period of relative peace allowed Europe to recover from the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars and laid the groundwork for the political and economic developments of the 19th century. The legacy of Waterloo. The legacy of the Battle of Waterloo extends far beyond the battlefield itself. In popular memory, it has become a symbol of the end of an era and the fall of a once unstoppable military leader. The phrase "meeting your Waterloo" has entered the common lexicon, signifying a decisive or final defeat. The battle also solidified the reputations of key figures, such as the Duke of Wellington, who became a national hero in Britain, and Napoleon, who, despite his defeat, continued to be admired for his military genius. Waterloo also had a profound impact on military history. The tactics and strategies used in the battle have been studied and debated by military scholars for generations. The effectiveness of defensive formations, such as infantry squares against cavalry, and the importance of combined arms tactics were key lessons drawn from Waterloo. Additionally, the battle highlighted the importance of coordination and timing between Allied forces, as demonstrated by the timely arrival of the Prussians under Blücher. The Battle of Waterloo was a pivotal event that shaped the course of European and world history. It marked the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, ending his reign in the Napoleonic Wars that had consumed Europe for over a decade. The battle brought an end to the revolutionary and Napoleonic era, allowing for the restoration of monarchies and the re-establishment of a balance of power in Europe. Its significance is still remembered and studied today, not only as a key military engagement but also as a defining moment in the political and social history of the 19th century.